It's time for episode 112 of The Crisis Show, now in its fourth year and seen in more than 120 countries. Good afternoon from New York. My name is Rich Klein. I'm president of Rich Klein Crisis Management and founder and host of The Crisis Show. Tonight, we're going to talk about what a lot of people around the world are talking about, and that is the issue of terrorism and workplace violence and security, a real important issue for all businesses, organizations, colleges, universities, and so forth. And I'm joined today by two really solid people who are experts in their fields. First of all, for the first time on The Crisis Show, his name is Tony Myhre from Everett, Washington, and he is an expert in exceptional physical security and emergency management. Tony, welcome to the show. You're joining us by phone.
Thank you, Rich.
So, Tony, thanks for joining us, and hopefully your audio will hold out on the phone. We had a little problem getting connected. As well, our other guest, regular on The Crisis Show, a great supporter of the show, an expert on workplace violence. His name is Felix Nater of Nater Associates. Hey, Felix.
Hey, Rich. Hey, Tony. Good to be on the show with you.
Tony, I want to make sure you can hear us. You can hear us okay?
Yes, sir.
Very good. Okay, so we're going to start with Felix because Felix has to get to a meeting in about 15 minutes. So, Felix, let me just say this for our viewers' benefit. Both Felix and Tony wrote really good pieces about the connection to San Bernardino. Felix wrote about workplace violence. Tony wrote about terrorism training for local police and private security. So let me start with you, Felix, and let me just preface this real quickly by saying when I first heard about this attack, and as I do, and we all do, we monitor these things. It's our business. I said to myself, Felix, this seems like a hybrid of certainly workplace violence because of what you taught me about workplace violence, but also terrorism because of my experience working for Jewish organizations, fighting terrorism and other work I've done for clients. So,
Sure.
And I know you and I talked in the green room earlier about, well, this, and I think, tell me about what your view is as we stand now. Of course, we all know that this is still an ongoing investigation. Let me just start by saying quickly something that needs to be said, of course, that, our hearts and prayers do go out to the families of the victims and all the people in San Bernardino who are going through this. And the world does support everybody there. And the outpouring of love, as we see all the time, is really good to see people coming together. But Felix, talk to me about this issue. I know you've taken a lot of heat on this, online and off. To tell us why this is primarily, I think is what you're saying from your piece, a workplace violence issue.
Well, I really took myself to task on researching everything that I knew from the media, from the various police and law enforcement press conferences. And I decided that I wanted to wait about 4 or 5 days before I actually wrote down my convictions. And for the listening audience, just for the sake of definition and clarification, workplace violence is only a classification that helps us understand the type of violence, but it is still violence. It is still a criminal violation of any sort of criminal code in whatever city, state you may live in. So the classification of it being workplace violence is only for that purpose. So I don't separate the two as being possibilities of a connection between some sort of domestic terrorism. I've always said that when you traumatize people at the end of a gun and you kill people in a workplace setting, I've always said it is domestic terrorism. The ideologues are huge in workplace environments and they run the extremist perspective. So I don't want people to misunderstand that workplace violence is an HR matter handling a misconduct of an employee. It's an escalation of emotions that runs the rampant. As I said in my article about my own experiences with the Postal Service's own shooting back in August of 1986 with Robert Sherrill. So there might be a hybrid situation, but with the totality of what's available for me to assess and evaluate, and I'm a critical assessor and evaluator of this stuff, I tend to feel, based upon what I've seen and what I've read from the witness accounts, that it's a inclination for me to believe it's a workplace violence, domestic terrorism, if you would, incident.
Now, would you say, Felix, that there could be an element of terrorism, or are you saying it's as it stands now in the information you've gathered that this is primarily domestic terrorism slash workplace violence?
Correct, correct. I think the information is inclining us to believe there's a connection primarily driven and motivated by the wife's association affiliations. The radical,
And so let me interrupt. So for you, and it's just interesting to me. So what you're saying, if I understand you, is it was the wife, the element of the wife as a shooter, and what they found, and the pledging to ISIS, that does add at least some degree of terrorism to this labeling, if you will, for lack of a
yeah,
better term.
yeah. If you want to stretch it, if you want to stretch it and you want to go beyond and you want to satisfy the consumers and the American citizens that we in law enforcement are doing everything in our power to keep you safe, we gotta not leave any stone unturned. So my point is, look at every single thing that drives your suspicious nature into verifying whether it is or isn't.
So, what's your message, Felix? And I know you're very busy with a lot of clients around the country. What is your message for like human resources people? And because obviously, I'm sure you're getting calls, all of us in this business, because we've all seen active shooters, we've seen incidents like this before, and we've seen the blame game. So, talk to us about what goes on inside an organization when an incident like this happens, or a company that says, you know what, we better start thinking about this. What do they say when they call you?
There's an article that I think I tweeted before 10:45 a.m. that dealt with what is your understanding of what workplace violence is. And until workplaces understand what workplace violence is, there'll always be this confusion by law enforcement and by non-law enforcement who look at it just as an HR problem. Let me explain something to you so you'd appreciate this. An active shooter is no different than a terrorist. Okay, they plan the same way. They're meticulous. In Dan Marco's definition of the five phases, they go from fantasy to implementation. And within those five phases of an active shooter, that could be an employee of any organization, they do the very same things that the terrorist does. They plan, they go to drills and exercises, they purchase the construction and materials for the construction of their IADs. They plan this diversions, they plan distractions, they go the whole 9 yards. On the day of that particular shooting, there's no telling whether or not that particular employee was instigated beyond the point of passionate acceptance of what was said. He may have been planning to go a little bit further in his decision to come in and shoot the workplace, but that scenario lended itself for him to go and get his wife and come in and do it on that day. So just because he's an employee engaged in workplace violence, Rich, doesn't mean he can't be an active shooter who goes through these five stages and getting to the implementation phase. So point number two, I think the HR community ought to stop internalizing the need to do workplace security training, believing that they have the expertise within. If they do, that's fine. But there ought to be a collaboration with outside experts who can bring a holistic understanding and approach to this that includes crisis communications, emergency management, the criminal end of it, how to conduct workplace investigations. Don't assume because you're HR, you have an obligation and responsibility to save the company money. You have an obligation and responsibility to protect the workforce against these sorts of incidents. You can minimize it by delivering the workforce quality training at no matter what the expense is. Stop with this computer-based training unless you have an expert on the ground, on the scene that can answer employee questions. Don't minimize the impact and don't commoditize workplace violence prevention. It is a human dimension and a human element that's a reflection of our microcosm and of our society.
Excellent points and great advice. And certainly in my work too, I always say that human resources is certainly a part of crisis management and crisis communications, but it can't be a silo. It has to be a team effort, and it has to start for. And you and I have talked about this as well. The culture counts for a lot, right? It has to start
It,
for the
it,
top.
it really does. The silos exist and the silos are rampant. And I want to challenge HR to be the leaders in workplace violence prevention by dismantling the silos and creating discourse and conversation and communication within organizations within the Get Smart umbrella, the Get Smart bubble. Classify those people in that room as being the recipients of classified information, but allow this team to discuss issues that can favorably impact the welfare, safety, and security of the workforce. Another point I want to make, and the security directives, you don't get paid to know it all. You don't get paid to say, I know what I'm doing and I know workplace violence. Reach out and partner with someone that you trust or someone who might be contrarian, like I may be, to help you be that partner so that there could be greater collaboration between that what you think you know and that what I know you don't know. So there's a lot of synergies that are disjointed, and until they're connected and there's a communication voice that is unified, that goes up and down the employee workforce and management chain of command, we'll never have the alignment in the prevention of workplace violence within any organization.
Yeah, it's great stuff. I mean, I would just add to that. It seems to me very logical that you should have HR, your head of security, your buildings manager people all together talking about, and not just when something happens or when you feel something's going to happen. Have regular meetings. Make this part of your regular planning at least once or twice a year, and think about where are the gaps, where are problems, where are vulnerabilities, and then bring someone in like you who's actually the expert, or somebody like Tony as well, who could actually assess where those weaknesses are. I do it on the communication side, right?
Well, you talk about Tony. You talk about Tony. I mean, we both collaborate.
Yeah.
He recognizes what I do. I recognize what he does, and he's not shy about recommending those people that he considers to be who have understanding of what to do. But here's another problem, and I know that time is not on my side. Workplace violence prevention training has to be comprehensive. It can't be a one-sided sit in the classroom and hear warning signs and risk factors, because within that toolkit there needs to be strategies of implementation and execution. Just knowing what warning signs and risk factors are is good for understanding of what to look for, but it could be John Q. Public going through a normal phase in his or her life. It could be a husband who's unhappy with what's happening in family court, not a criminal and not predisposed to violence. So when you just codify the warning signs and apply them to one individual without really assessing and evaluating the potential, then you're not really doing those employees who are receiving the training any value, and pretending that you're addressing workplace violence prevention.
Gotcha. Well, thank you. Well, I'm going to bring Tony in now. And Felix, I know if you have to drop out, just you can do that when you need to go, obviously. Tony, you're still with us, right, on audio?
I am here.
Okay. So, Tony, thanks again for standing by. You wrote a really good piece as well on LinkedIn as well yesterday called Terrorism Training for Local Police and Private Security. But before we get into that, there was some breaking news this morning for your benefit and our viewers. Our FBI director, James Comey, testified before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. And the latest headline out of the New York Times is that the shooters, this couple, had been talking about these attacks as far back as 2 years ago and had done some target shooting practice as well. So I just want to add that to the conversation, and I don't know if it changes anything you've written or adds another degree to it, but I wanted to bring that up. That was a breaking story this morning, that even before she entered the United States on this visa, they had been in contact. So if anybody wants to read that, the Times article, it's certainly there and I'm sure there'll be more detail when we go off the air, when this recording is done. There'll be more details that come out of this. But anyway, I want to start with that. So Tony, I think you talked about in your article, excuse me, you talk about the subject of terrorism and counter-terror training for local law enforcement and security officers. Walk us through what you wrote about and where you think the problems are, and also what you think. I think we'd all agree the San Bernardino police did an incredible job at response. But I think what you would talk about is prevention, right?
Absolutely, and that speaks to what Felix was just talking about as far as the synergies between the different entities within an organization. Even in the case of this organization being a county agency that the suspect worked for, there was a lot of indications in the weeks leading up to the attack in San Bernardino where there should have been some mechanisms triggered. He had apparently a pretty heated argument with another individual in that workplace, and made what would, by all accounts, seem to be some threats, and certainly something that falls under the category of hate speech. Speaking against someone and making threats on the basis of that person's race. So the point at which those types of incidents occur, and you don't have a human resource within that unit, and then also the human resources mechanisms. That there's a problem here. Where there's smoke, there's usually fire, and in this case, there was absolutely fire, given the evidence that's come out that these folks were radicalized, that they had trained, that they had planned, that they had received apparently funding before the fact. So as it relates to training, it obviously extends beyond just law enforcement and security, in the sense that even the human resources personnel and the folks in the management and supervision of these agencies, they all could have had a hand in preventing something like this.
Yeah.
Triggering a reporting mechanism and some follow-up.
Right,
Sure.
right. You put, yeah, and you mentioned, forgive me because I'm a layperson, and there's a lot of, like a lot of industry, a lot of bureaucratic titles that you use in this great piece you wrote: federal law enforcement officer, protective security officer, federal LEO. It sounds to me that, and you mentioned something really jumped out at me, Tony, and it was at the very end of your piece, and you. And it could have gone anywhere, certainly. And I think you talked about this 3 hours. You said you were surprised that, let me just find it again, if I can. I kind of lost my thought here scrolling through, forgive me. But maybe you might remember it. It was this 3 hours of training for security officers. Can you elaborate on that?
That was actually the Washington State Criminal Justice Training Commission basic law enforcement academy for police officers in the state of Washington. So every law enforcement officer in Washington State goes through what they call BLEA at the Criminal Justice Training Commission Academy. And in that block of training, several hundred hours worth of training, there's only 3 hours of training that have anything to do with terrorism. And that was based upon an assessment that I performed yesterday, just going through the curriculum. All of the coursework was laid out, the days and hours that it was involved. 1 hour dedicated to counterterror training, and 2 hours dedicated to IED and explosive recognition.
Wow.
There are obviously a lot of issues with that, in my estimation, as I outlined in that piece, particularly given that there's an extensive number of security officers above and beyond the number of police officers that are on duty in any given jurisdiction at any particular time, particularly in the larger cities and counties around the country.
And those would be the soft targets we're talking about, right, Tony?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And those people, the security personnel, in a lot of cases, receive either wholly inadequate or no training at all as it relates to counter surveillance or counterterror.
Sure.
Women, those folks have even more of an important role in the sense that they're the ones that are physically fixed at a location for several hours a night, every night, watching over those buildings, watching over those power plants or oil refineries, or all of the different examples that I've provided. So they're not receiving more comprehensive training, even at the pre-assignment level, where the curriculum of the state in which they're working, those states that have licensing requirements, when they don't have any measure of significant counterterrorism or homeland security related kind of all hazards, if you will, training, it really puts the private sector and even the public sector folks that contract with private security agencies at a significant disadvantage when those personnel aren't adequately trained in threat recognition, in threat mitigation, even in response once an event does occur.
Well, let me ask you, so if I understand this correctly, you're talking primarily about private security, let's say in a building, right? A big high-rise, let's say in Seattle or New York, whatever, Chicago, that are not getting the proper training. And from what I understand from what you just said, you read this about Washington State. Do you, and Felix, please jump in as well, do either of you or both of you think that this is a problem nationwide, A, and B, is it limited to just the private security, or is it actually a problem with the police departments as well, which I doubt, but I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I look at it from the perspective that, first of all, as it relates to law enforcement, police officers are not generally tasked with physical security duties. They're generally responding to 911 calls, handling the robberies and the domestic violence calls, traffic stops, those types of things.
Interesting. Yeah, good point.
Sure.
It makes sense in a way that they don't receive more comprehensive training on the pre-assignment basis, in other words, in the academy. that if they're not receiving that training on the front end, and this is again based upon my individual experience with a variety of local law enforcement agencies as it relates to incidents with a nexus to terrorism, that the officers, the line guys, the 911 call, shaggers out there that are patrolling the beats, when they arrive on an incident like that, where it's simply been a soft probe, or it's been some disturbing behavior, or it's been some active type of surveillance, their recognition of that incident as a potential issue as it relates to surveillance in preparation for a terrorist attack is lacking. And as you run into individual officers, you may find that based upon that officer's military experience, or perhaps their corporate security experience rather, before they got into the private sector, they may have better recognition. But a lot of folks just come out of college or otherwise don't have that depth of knowledge. So I do believe that it is lacking in the training that the police officers receive in the academy. There needs to be a little more comprehensive counterterrorism or homeland security related training there.
Yeah, and and I'll just jump in. It seems to me, gentlemen, that pre 9/11, this was considered military, right? It was considered, National Guard, military people dealt with this. And you think that, I guess, here we are, 14 years after 9/11, that some things remain the same, unfortunately, that there's still this, and maybe it goes back to what you said, Felix, about silos of bureaucracy and owning things or not owning them. It's just, my thought for the moment on that. But
it's
in?
funny. Let me jump in for a minute, because Tony raises a lot of valid points. And then going back to how we connected on Twitter, it's just incredible how like minds think alike. Not ever knowing his background, everything he said just now to us and to your audience is exactly what I believe in. Several years ago, I collaborated with a company called Trinity to put together a workplace violence prevention program for the role of security officers. It didn't go off the shelf as appealing and attractive as I thought it would have. But Tony raises a good point. If I were to be able to train, or someone like me were to be able to train security officers and law enforcement as part of the first responder to a workplace incident like this, I would have them specifically trained in how to collect the information upon arrival. There's a lot of good stuff that's being lost and not conveyed because people are worrying about the victims, and rightfully so. But they should know how to collect, analyze, and evaluate the information so they can construct early on what has possibly transpired. Deploying security officers without training them in the possible role in workplace violence prevention is a civil liability waiting to happen, of great proportions. How do you tell me my workplace is secure and my employees feel secure that just because they're carrying guns, they are providing that level of security? They might be physically, but do they know how to minimize the risk, prevent, and understand their roles? I would say that this would enhance their marketability and enhance their ability to deploy higher end security officers if they just escalate and provide this kind of training. You're absolutely right, Tony. There's got to be getting away from whiz bang training. I heard Tony said that when he assessed and evaluated that mandated training in Washington State, 2 hours to IED, 1 hour to terrorism. You look exactly what's going on with the police departments today. They're offering this free active shooter training, but they're not going into the workplace to explain to the employer what to do, what his or her commitments and responsibilities are. You can train employees in this whiz bang stuff of what to do to minimize their risk. But what about the people who are already killed, after this guy went postal, so to speak? So I think we have a need to package this stuff in such a way where the responsibility of execution and implementation and investment is an organizational wide thing, not just an employee responsibility, because it doesn't really meet the test of being prepared when it's only delivered to employees, or to a security manager, or to a safety manager, or to an HR director. It's got, for example, I can't mention the name of the international organization, but when they hired me to come in and look at their active shooter program, I said, I don't want to do an active shooter program. I want to do a comprehensive workplace violence prevention program that protects you and me long after I'm gone. And they brought on the notion that perhaps they needed to be a little bit more aggressive, and not necessarily terming it active shooter, but looking at it as a hostile intruder threat to organizations, and what the organization needs to do to prepare the workplace, and what employees need to know to minimize their risk, absent of the cavalry and absent before the arrival of the police.
Yeah, and I would just echo that. And Felix, I know you've heard this from me, and and Tony, you may not have heard it, but yeah, there's a real synergy here because in my work as well, it's I'll get the call at the 11th hour. We think there's a problem. Whether it's an HR problem with an employee that may go not necessarily postal, but may cause a reputation problem at some level, or something has just happened, and they'll call and say, we need your help in messaging it. But what you just said was very helpful to me as well, Felix, in my business on the communication side, because you're exactly right. It's about the preparation to prevent the problem. And you really you hit the nail on the head right there. That's something that whether you're in HR or you're in the CEO's office, at any level of a company or organization, this is something you have to think about. You have to think about it holistically, and you got to think about it regularly throughout the year and make it part of your business planning, not just when something happens. And then you're calling somebody like Tony or Felix or myself and say, we desperately need your help. It's a lot harder to help you on the reputation side or on and more importantly, and what we're talking about here, the safety and security of your employees and your guests who may come to your office and so forth. It's much more important to make sure that they're safe and sound. And that's something I think that you're talking about, which is we can save lives. I think we all agree we can't eliminate terrorism. We can't eliminate active shooters, but we can save lives. And we can reduce injuries. Right?
Well, you could do that. You could do that. And Tony is an expert in emergency management. You could do that and really look back on the witness stand when you take the witness stand as an employee and say, you know what, my company really delivered outstanding training. And my company really put a lot of measures in place to minimize my risk. And you know what? I think this is out of the norm, but I think you're being inappropriate in asking me if my company was negligent. I'm proud of the energy invested in my workplace safety and security. It wasn't a policy on the shelf waiting for the day to happen to call Rich, and then Rich will call his associates, Felix and Tony. It was a proactive, ongoing process of workplace safety and security that everybody had a hand in, from the CEO down to me at the low end of the totem pole. So as I walk out, let me just say this. I'll venture to challenge any organization with the exception of my clients, that none of their CEOs know what's transpiring within their organization on a monthly basis or quarterly basis, only when it happens. I'll bet you they never get briefed on the status of their at-risk situations until after an event happens that's litigious or that gets reported to the police. And my second point before I leave you, which is another point I want to leave you with, is that if we're going to invest in workplace violence prevention, we can't dummy down the message. We got to say, folks, this is a criminal violation we're looking into. The behavior that we're talking about, though it is covered under the employee handbook and misconduct, once you cross the line of civility, we're going to do everything in our power to prosecute anybody who threatens anybody with bodily harm. And we're going to prosecute anybody who threatens anybody with a vehicle or a weapon or anything. This is not the culture that we want to establish. Until that gets conveyed with that sort of tough, caring love, we're always going to have employees that are confused because the message is disjointed. Are you here to penalize me and terminate me, or are you here to provide me safety and security? Otherwise, I'm not speaking until you convince me of both.
Great point. And thank you for all your wisdom as usual. I know you have to leave, and we'll stay on with Tony. Thanks again, Felix. And for our viewers' benefit, Felix Nater and Associates. Felix is based out of North Carolina and Long Island. Is that correct?
That's still correct, yes.
Okay, good.
I'm out of here. So, Tony, enjoy yourself. This is a great opportunity for you and Rich to connect. I just love Rich and what he stands for.
Thank you.
Merry Christmas.
Take care. Right back to you.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye. Tony, you still with me?
I am.
Very good. So let me just pull you back up on the screen here. At least we'll get your article up here since you don't have your video. So I don't know if you want to pick up on anything that Felix said, or is there something that you wanted to elaborate on before we wrap up? I know I'm sorry, lost my voice for a second. Talk if there's anything else you wanted to add to the discussion that maybe we didn't get to yet.
Well, just adding to what Felix was talking about as it relates to private corporations with their security mechanisms, and frankly, the same thing can pertain to law enforcement agencies in the sense that people frequently get calls for service at private workplaces. I can recall I was doing work for one of the large multinational security companies, and we were tasked with providing workplace violence suppression. In other words, something had already gone wrong, and they needed armed, undercover type of people in the workplace because of an individual that for many years had spoken to people in the workplace in an inappropriate manner, had displayed signs of aggression and hostility many times, spoke to his fascination with firearms, spoke to his fascination with violence as a whole. And unfortunately, until that person snapped, there was no mitigation. There was no internal type of process undertaken to prevent that threat from occurring.
Right.
So until the person showed up with a gun at work, the security mechanisms that they had in place, which was another of the multinational security companies, their security officers at that point had no threat recognition training. They had no workplace violence training. They had no, there's two programs that come to mind, both the management of aggressive behavior, which is more tuned towards response, but then also nonviolent crisis intervention, which is a great program that I've used as far back as 1998 when I worked in corporate security for another large multinational company. Nonviolent crisis intervention teaches a great number of pre-attack indicators, looking for the signs of aggression and hostility, and then also talking about things that can be done not only by security officers, but by individuals throughout the dynamic, throughout a corporation or organization, to report those types of behaviors to their human resources mechanisms. And frankly, as we've seen, the evening news for the last couple of years has been inundated with talk about law enforcement officers and excessive uses of force, alleging that there's all of these different components to police using too much force. And a lot of police departments have taken kind of a proactive approach to that and said, well, there may be something to that. And they've started putting their police officers through crisis intervention training. And those are some of the same tools, the same core kind of foundational pieces, if you will, of a training program where a security officer or a police officer could see, okay, maybe this person is going above and beyond just shooting his mouth off, so to speak, and then be able to trigger additional investigative and mitigation mechanisms that will prevent a further violent act, which I believe is completely what could and should have happened in the case of San Bernardino, where had someone triggered that kind of law enforcement or security and human resources, again, collaborative response to this individual's behavior, we may not be having this conversation today. 14 people might not have lost their lives. The other 21 that were injured may not have been injured.
Great
and
point.
that's why I think it's absolutely critical that law enforcement and security officers receive additional training in this type of not only threat assessment, but also what to do, internal to an organization, or even externally if they have the organization, the company has to involve law enforcement in a response. There's agencies out there that do a great job of partnering with their private partners, within their jurisdictions to prevent those type of incidents from happening. And that's something that I have models that I've looked at here in the local area that I think should be employed on a national basis. And certainly what my piece was speaking to was more from the standpoint of some minimum training standards as it relates to terrorism and violence prevention kind of as a whole. This incident, of course, had a nexus to terrorism, which is why I focused on that. But I don't believe it would have been elevated to the point where a terrorist attack would have occurred had some of these more kind of foundational and core responses and mitigation efforts been undertaken.
Yeah, let me ask you another question that's somewhat related to this and certainly timely. I know you have a lot of good law enforcement colleagues around the country based on what I'm reading here on your profile. I live most of my time in the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York, where I'm broadcasting from today. Big news out of my area in the Hudson Valley was this, and you may have seen this on Fox News, where he was on the other day, the sheriff of Ulster County, New York, which is Kingston and New Paltz. If you look at a map, it's actually where I went to school and worked at one time. The sheriff made a statement on Facebook, a written statement that basically encouraging citizens who are licensed carriers of pistols, I guess it's just firearms in general. If they have a permit. I'm not a gun owner or an expert, but basically what he said was, arm yourselves. If you're a licensed firearm owner, I encourage you to carry them. And this was right after San Bernardino. He was then followed by the sheriff in my county, who seconded that idea. And there's a conversation going on now about citizens, taking a role in this. And I wonder what your opinion was on this, if you have one, and if you think this is helpful or not, because it's certainly a big topic of conversation going forward.
I've seen several of those reports, and the sheriff of King County here in Seattle recently said something somewhat similar. The chief of police of Detroit, same type of statement. I don't encourage everyone to carry a gun. Obviously, there's a lot of responsibility involved. If you have the weapon and you're carrying the weapon, you should know how to use the weapon. What I believe is that it boils down to, has the person, the citizen, received adequate training in the use of firearms? If we're talking about a former law enforcement officer, someone who's been doing high-risk security, a former military member, those people have received adequate training in the use of firearms.
Amen. I agree.
Average citizen, I think if we're going to advocate for the people to start carrying their guns, perhaps we should also look at it from the standpoint of maybe the private citizen should also have some situational awareness training.
Thank you.
Some firearms or weapons retention training. Because if the bad guy gets the gun away from the citizen, that adds a dynamic that could be obviously problematic.
Yeah, and I would just say real quickly to interrupt you, Tony, is that's exactly my view. In fact, I tweeted back, or I wrote something on Facebook saying I'm all for that exactly what you said. If we know that the people carrying have that, and if they're not former law enforcement, and because there's so many people who use the guns primarily just for hunting, right, or for the self-defense at home, which is fine. But what my fear was and remains is people who maybe go deer hunting a few times a year and think they're qualified to take on a terrorist or an active shooter with an AR-15 or whatever. I think you're right, and I actually made that point myself. That hey, let's do the training. I agree. Look, law enforcement is overwhelmed. They're very often underfunded in smaller communities. They can't be everywhere at once. That's fine, but let's make sure they're qualified. And if they're not qualified, and one of the things missing from in my view, from the Ulster County Sheriff's announcement was, hey, look, you know what? We do need your help, and we're going to offer you twice a year some situational awareness training, which is the right word, and firearm safety as well, because you can never have enough safety training, I believe, in anything, right? So and certainly I think the local governments, a state government would fund something like that, because that's showing responsibility. So that's just my opinion on it. I think we are in a more dangerous world, no question, but it has to go along with not making it more dangerous because people are not taking the responsibility seriously enough, or they just don't know what they don't know, right? So excellent points. Yeah. So
a friend of mine who's also a former military member with extensive combat experience and also worked in the private sector in Iraq and Afghanistan both. He runs a consulting firm and actually a firearms trading company in the Denver, Colorado area, Dave Maris. He quite frequently posts on social media, as it relates to active shooters and that type of thing. But a quote that he frequently puts out is, carry your gun, get training with your gun, and when the time comes, get in there and end some madness. Obviously he's speaking to clientele that has a lot to do more so with law enforcement or military personnel. But the key in that, the key phrase, if you will, in that quote is get training with your gun.
Right.
Having untrained people out there playing firearms with people, not such a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, and we're seeing that. In fact, I will tell you that something very disturbing came up right after that on one of my county Facebook pages that's very popular. As soon as that announcement went out, this gentleman, who I don't know, he put up a post that said, I'm starting a militia group. Who wants to join? I'm not quoting him exactly, but he was recruiting, and I had no idea who this person was. And I said to myself, this is dangerous, particularly if this guy is not the kind of person that you're talking about, that I'm talking about, somebody who's a former military, former law enforcement, retired, whatever, who's trained in this. But just to say I have a gun, let's form a militia is a very scary thought, that suddenly you're, we don't need a bunch of Clint Eastwoods out there, So anyway.
No, and that's why what I've offered here is a opinion and advice, and the same thing that Felix was speaking to. We have a plethora of existing protective and security and public safety mechanisms in this country. Let's train those mechanisms better. Let's focus them better. Let's give them the tools, the resources, and the mindset that they need to more adequately protect the public and their private interests. And I think things like militia groups or asking citizens to carry their guns everywhere they go would probably be diminish the need for such a thing, or the perceived need. I think that's more important. Is a lot of this fear type of based response to these incidents. Obviously, if people are watching the 24-hour news cycle, social media is prolific in people's palms as they walk around looking at their phones. They know almost instantly what's going on in
That's right.
the country and the planet. So awareness, in some sense, breeds fear, and fear breeds these kind of knee-jerk reactions of, oops, I better carry my gun everywhere I go, type of things. But I think if our protectors, the people that we already pay to provide these services, and that frankly that we entrust to provide these services, we're given a more comprehensive level of training and frankly insight as to what it is that they really should be doing on a daily basis as it relates to this kind of broader spectrum of protection, i.e. the terrorism threat or the active shooter threat. Just the recognition of the behaviors alone, combined with mitigation of those behaviors, getting the person some help, reporting them to the appropriate authorities so that they can investigate the person. I think if those types of things were employed more prolifically around the country, we'd be seeing a lot less of these incidents.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for all this. We're going to start to wrap up, and this is all very helpful. Tony's, for our viewers' benefit, Tony Myhre's company is Jet City Consulting out of Everett, Washington. I imagine, like many of us today, Tony, you work globally, and we advise people through Skype and Google Hangouts on air and privately when we can't be there. But certainly, this is what we talked about today, folks. Whoever's listening out there, these are important issues. And I just want to wrap up with something in my area, but also applies to what Tony does and what Felix does. And it's this. There are 3 key timelines in a crisis: before, during, and after. And as a company or as an organization, you have to think about all 3 timelines in a crisis situation to protect your people and your assets, and to be able to communicate effectively to protect your reputation at all stages. But you can't just be in a reactive mode. I think what you've heard from Felix Nater and Tony today is the fact that you have to think about this as part of your regular business planning and not just have a knee-jerk reaction. So with that, thank you so much for watching. Tony from Everett, Washington, it was a pleasure having you. Hopefully next time we'll get your handsome face on the video as well, and get you in for a discussion again. Unfortunately, we're going to see more of these incidents. I think we all know that at some point, at least at the active shooter phase. We've seen too many of these. And we've seen too much gun violence for sure, and we'll continue to use this show to talk about the issues that we hope will help minimize these tragedies. So thank you all for watching. Happy holidays to everybody, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Rich.
Thank you, Tony. Be well.